Just Like Us, for LGBT young people.
Hello everyone, my name is Arbër and welcome to the Just Like Us monthly podcast. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm here with Elly.
Hello, good to be here again. My name is Elly, as you said. My pronouns are they and them. We're doing good. How are you doing? I mean, I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm okay. It's currently the American election, so everything's just a bit stressful, right now. So we're going to have a good conversation today. How are you, Elly?
Yeah, I feel the same. I'm doing all right generally, but I feel like it's just a time when there's 1,000 things going on in the world that are stressful. So It's good. We're going to have a conversation that I think will take our minds off all the stresses of the world, and we're going to do a bit of discussion and just celebration of trans identities.
You're listening to Just Like Us, the monthly show for LGBT young people.
This upcoming week, from the 13th to the 19th of November, it is Trans Awareness Week. And this is a time where we really kind of celebrate the trans identity and really look at bringing more representation for transgender people and their experiences. We have Elly here, and Elly identifies as non-binary. So we just wanted to open up a conversation of what that trans identity and what it means to be transgender and non-binary from an individual who has that identity themselves. So take it away, Elly.
Cool, yeah. So we are celebrating. Please insert some party music here for the celebration. Yeah, so I'm going to basically just do a quick, explanation of really the basics of, what gender is. Because I think a lot of the time people will confuse gender and biological sex, where biological sex is about your physical body, how you are born, your sex characteristics, such as your sex organs, your hormones, your chromosomes, and things like this. And gender actually relates to your inner sense of your manhood, womanhood, or other genderhood. And it's much more of an internal sense rather than to do with your physical body. So for most people, the two things, gender and sex, will probably align. So a lot of people's sex will be male and their gender is man, and it will be the same. So they probably won't really have thought about it before. And if that is the case for you, then you are what is described as a cisgender person, which basically just is what that means. And so transgender is then quite easy to understand because it's basically just the opposite of that. So it just means that you don't identify with the gender that you were assigned at birth. So it means that your biological sex and your inner sense of your gender, they don't align. So one thing that people do sometimes get confused as well, which I just want to quickly cover, is trans man and trans woman. People get confused which one goes with which person. So the thing to remember is that if someone identifies as a woman, they are a woman. So a trans woman is a woman who is trans. So someone who was assigned male at birth and is a woman, if you see what I mean. And trans man is the opposite. And then non-binary is someone who identifies as neither a man or a woman. So they can have either biological sex. But yeah, it's just anyone who identifies on another part of the spectrum of gender. So that's just a bit of a basic facts dump. I hope you enjoyed that. If you didn't know much about trans identities, that's a quick run through of it. So yeah, we can talk a bit more about the experience though, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I'm just putting this question to you, Elly. When exactly did you realize you were non-binary, and how did you actually navigate that?
That is a big question. It's something that I didn't have one moment of realization. I feel like I went through kind of my childhood, my teenage years, being just very confused about the whole thing. I didn't know, I always assumed I was assigned female at birth. I was like, well, that must be me, because that's what everyone's telling me. So, I don't have any reason to tell them they're wrong. But there's some parts of it, in fact, quite a lot of it, that just didn't really seem to fit with me. And I always felt a bit odd being put in that box. It always felt like, I don't really belong here, but this is where I'm supposed to be. So I'm just gonna, just try and make myself fit into that box. And then as I sort of grew up and navigated the world, I came across people who were non-binary, and I was like, oh, I didn't know that was an option. I didn't know that was a thing. And then, that was in the back of my head for a long while. And I was for a long time thinking, maybe it's me, maybe it's not me. I didn't know, because I think I'd spent a lot of my life trying to fit into this box that I'd been assigned. And so I felt very reluctant to accept that wasn't me, because I felt like, well, for this many years, I have done all the woman things, I've worn the woman's clothes and done the women's makeup and the whatever else,
Mm-hmm.
So it was really weird to get to a point where I realized, actually, that's not me. This word that I've discovered actually fits me a lot better. So I've really enjoyed sort of coming into that realization, albeit very slowly and gradually.
Did you find it quite liberating when you did actually say, there's this, because obviously the term non-binary as itself, as a label, is somewhat quite contemporary and modern, but obviously the identity has obviously always existed. But how did you feel when you actually had a name that you could actually call it? You could finally kind of match a feeling to a word and a label.
Yeah, I found it so liberating probably is the word, just of the feeling of even just knowing that because there's a word for it, it's not just me. That felt very validating. I was like, oh, other people feel this too. It's similar. We have the same experience. I feel the same as somebody else. And that just made me think, okay, then I feel more confident in that. And I also just felt more confident as a person, because I felt unrestricted by trying to fit into something which didn't feel comfortable to fit into. I was suddenly oh, I can just, move freely. And the analogy which I often have given when trying to explain this to people is trying on different pairs of shoes. That I felt I've been walking in shoes that were a size too small for my whole life. And it's I could walk in them, but they were super uncomfortable and they were rubbing my feet in all the wrong places. And then I finally found shoes that were the right size and comfortable to walk in. And I was oh, this is what it's like, I never experienced this before, but I'm suddenly just able to, just everything is more comfortable, just moving through the world in every way is easier.
Well, that's really amazing, because comfort is key in life, really, obviously. And actually just building off that, how was it for you to actually come out as non-binary? Obviously, with more kind of known identities, whether that be gay or lesbian or transgender even, these identities have a bit more kind of representation in society. So how was that process coming out to your friends and family, or have you come out to your friends and family?
I have not come out to everyone in my life. I'm out to my friends at Just Like Us, which is obviously a super accepting space because we're all people in the LGBT spectrum community, and there's a whole range of ambassadors with different identities and experiences. So that's a very welcoming environment where it feels super safe. And I've also come out to some of my other friends who they already knew that I was LGBT anyway. And so I kind of knew that they would probably be accepting. Yeah, as you say, it is difficult with, it being a less unknown and less common thing as an identity, which doesn't make it any less important to talk about. It, in fact, makes it probably more important to talk about, because if people haven't heard of it before, they don't quite know how to react.
Yeah, definitely.
And my friends, they're very accepting, but some of them, they wanted to, discuss a little more about what it meant. And some of them, make slip-ups with, my pronouns and how I like to be referred to and things like that. And so it's one of those things that's just taking a bit longer, but that's kind of part of the experience, and I don't resent them for that, because I know that they're really trying and really putting effort in to learn and be better. So that's as welcoming as as I would want.
Yeah. And just going off that, what do you think are some of the stereotypes and perceptions that you've either personally experienced or you see kind of thrown out about in society about your identity as a non-binary person?
I think the main obstacle you get is just that it's not a thing. That's the main thing of oh, you're just extra gay. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
because people, for a long time perceive me as a woman who dates women. And I identify as bisexual, but I do mostly date women. I think that it's one of the stereotypes, really, that kind of is an obstacle to people's coming out and accepting themselves, is that because within lesbian culture, we have people who present more masculine as a choice of style and expression of themselves. People assume that that's what it is, when I'm like, it's a different thing. It's a kind of it's a level beyond that. I don't have a connection to, particularly towards womanhood. Is not something that I feel strongly is me. And there's an experience of dysphoria, which we can define if anyone doesn't know what that word means. So dysphoria means sort of a sense of like unease or dissatisfaction, and it's kind of discusses the clashing of your gender identity inwardly and the way that you're perceived, or the way that you are externally. For example, your biological sex characteristics not matching your internal sense of how they should be, or people addressing you in the wrong way in terms of gender.
So just kind of going off that as well, how do you feel we could potentially, as a society, make it easier for young children who are non-binary and don't know it yet, or transgender? How do you think we could actually create a society which is a bit more kind of easier for younger non-binary and trans people to kind of come up in and find their identity?
I think for me, I always felt what was useful to me and was positive in my experience growing up is that I felt able to be flexible within the boundaries of gender, and it was never something that I would feel ostracized or criticized for example, dress in more masculine clothing or act in a more masculine way, at any stage of my growing up. I was always one of those kids that was like, grubbing around in the dirt and all of this. I wasn't like, pristine and playing with dollies and whatever. And I think that's the sort of thing that is anyway moving onwards, because the stereotypes of, boys should do this and girls should do this are already being broken down, because they are damaging to everyone in society to say that you have to be a certain way because of a gender that you are, and especially if that's a gender that you're assigned and you don't identify with. So I think that was a really great thing that helps me, and I think that that's something that we as a society can do is when we see someone acting unusually within their their gender that we think they are, we perceive it as unusual. Let them express and explore, because that's really how you find out about yourself. The other thing I would say is just education, because as I mentioned, I was so confused throughout my life because I'd never heard this word before, and I didn't know about trans people. So I think, the education that they're starting more and more to bring into schools now, just giving you some information that these identities exist, other people have these experiences, and this is what some words mean, and the resources that are becoming available to young people now. I think that's going to make more and more of a change.
Yeah, definitely. And I do agree with you. I think that kind of like just that space, just to kind of be yourself and express yourself in your time and with your terms, I think is really important. And I think that's something that all parents should, and all teachers and everybody in society should allow for younger children, just to kind of be raised in an environment where they have that freedom to express themselves in the way that actually, they can and define themselves. So we just want to also speak and touch on the media representation of, especially in recent times, the representation of non-binary people, Sam Smith, Janelle Monáe. For you, Ellie, do you have any kind of like icons or figures or idols who have come out as either non-binary or transgender that you can really relate to their experience and feel like bring a positive representation for the community?
Yeah, I mean, it is difficult because there are only a handful of people that are very out within the media as non-binary. Someone that I found really inspiring is Ruby Rose, who identifies as gender fluid. I just am very inspired by anyone who has sort of gone through a trans experience and made a success of themselves, because it just feels like sometimes such a hindrance to your life, and that, you know, you sometimes feel like, oh, it's so many people don't accept it and won't accept you being yourself. And to see someone being confidently themselves and moving forward and upwards in their life and making a success of themselves is so positive to me.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I'm not transgender and I'm not non-binary. But for me, one of my biggest idols just in life and role models is probably Monroe Bergdorf. I just love what she's done. I just love what she's been able to do for, you know, the trans community, the Black community in the UK as well. She's really propelled issues to another level, and I think she's been hugely influential in bringing a conversation about trans identities to the forefront in the UK, and she's done it in such an educational way, and she's really become a pioneer for trans rights in the UK, especially for people of colour and those most marginalised. So definitely,
yes,
I love Monroe Bergdorf.
I love her too, and I just love how she's just so like fearlessly speaks her beliefs. It's really you know, it's really empowering to see someone just it's empowering to see anyone just sort of come out and be themselves and say what they think and state it strongly and with conviction. I love that.
With so much, exactly. It's with that conviction.
You're listening to Just Like Us, the monthly show for LGBT young people.
Going from more kind of contemporary idols and experiences and identities, we also wanted to touch on the kind of experiences of trans identities in history and within different cultures globally. Me personally, I studied history at university level, and I specialized in kind of like sexuality and gender diversity, and I'm also currently studying my master's in gender and sexuality studies as well, so this is something that I find quite interesting. And just looking throughout history, you know, a lot of the time this idea that trans identities and gender fluidity and non-binary identities are something that is quite kind of like a modern concept is somewhat problematic, because although labels like, for example, LGBT, the label itself is something that is quite modern in the sense that I think it was founded in the 1980s or 70s, I think it was. And although the labels are somewhat modern, the identities have always existed in some form. And I think it really does bode well to kind of bring forward that educational background and the clear-cut evidence that these identities have always existed. An example that we can show is in the indigenous peoples of America, in North America and also in South America, they have an identity known as Two-Spirit. And this is an individual with a gender diverse identity that differs to just male and female. And in fact, these identities were actually highly regarded in these societies. They were seen as, you know, hugely respectful individuals. And because these societies were very spiritual, they were seen as more spiritually kind of superior in a way to the typical male and females. Another example can be the Balkans, where I'm originally from. There was an identity known as the Sworn Virgins, and a female at any age could declare herself celibate for life, and she could basically transition into a man, and he would live their lives as a male all their lives, basically. And even though that example in of itself is quite problematic, because it concerns obviously sexuality, that they weren't able to have sex, which means that they could potentially be a man, which that's quite problematic. But the identity of actually transitioning to another gender is very much there, and it's there in history. And as human beings, we have the need to kind of, you know, people have always consistently tried to put us in boxes and say that you have to be this way, you have to look away, you have to be the same as everybody else. But the reality of the situation is that human beings, as innate within us, we are diverse, and we're diverse in our mentalities, and we're diverse in our experiences. And this is something that is shown throughout history as well. And a key reason as to why society has these very kind of fixed gender roles and gender identities is because of colonization. You know, colonization in, you know, the British Empire, for example, the British had kind of developed ideas of respectability and ideas of gender and sexuality and what it meant to be a respectable man and a respectable woman. And when they went to these different countries globally, colonizing them, and they interacted with these gender diverse people, they saw them as deviant and they saw them as perverted, because of course they didn't understand them and they didn't understand where they were coming from. And so they automatically demonized them. And these demonizations went against key identities and aspects, which is why we have the transphobia and the discrimination that we have against certain members, well, all members of the LGBT plus community, but specifically trans people. And we need to actually be vocal about these identities because they've always existed and they're just as valid as any other identity. And yeah, we need to be vocal about them.
I found that so interesting. Like, I'm like on the edge of my seat right now. Because
Nice.
yes, I mean, Arbër knows so much. And
try.
I love it. And I think it is worth mentioning about, you know, as you say, like our culture, I think often we can perceive ourselves as being, you know, one of the better countries for being LGBT plus, which is in general, we are not bad. But as you say, a lot of the problems that we have in terms of homophobia and transphobia, biphobia, etc., come from values instilled by British culture in its history. And so we can't be too quick to declare ourselves better than others. Although I think our country is ahead in a lot of ways, we have to remember the things still worth fighting for and that we need to move forward on.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's all about kind of recognizing that position that you have in history. And like you said, and I think it really does have real effects in the present day, like you said, in terms of legality, in terms of politics, in terms of social acceptance. We need to understand that, yes, although the trans conversation, for example, has really come up recently, with especially because of media personalities, but we also need to understand that there needs to be that, you know, non-binary representation as well, so that we're able to normalize this identity, so that there can be progression in society.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think we are making such good steps in that, because as we were saying, there are media examples that we can list now. So it's really amazing that we've got more of these role models. I just remembered another one, Jonathan Van Ness, who I am obsessed with. And I can't believe I didn't think of them before. I'm so upset. I'm sorry, Jonathan, if you're listening. Jonathan's not listening. I would die.
Can you believe?
But as you say, it's a more recent conversation. And I think it's really great to hear about, like, as you were describing, the historical and different cultural ideas of gender, because it is one of those misconceptions that this is a modern thing and it's a new idea and it's something that the kids have come up with this generation, which is just not true, because there are trans and non-binary people of different ages. You know, there are elderly trans and non-binary people and, you know, people in history and across, you know, recorded history who have experienced gender in diverse ways. So it's really just fascinating to explore that, because it really debunks that myth that it's a modern thing.
You're listening to Just Like Us, the monthly show for LGBT young people.
One thing we should mention today, while we're on a celebratory trans celebration, we can generally celebrate because this is our 30th episode of the podcast. We made it to episode 30, and considering we come out with a podcast once a month, that's quite a lot of months. My maths is really not great, but that's like more than 2 years, right?
12 and 12. Yeah, it's 2 years and 6 months.
That is amazing. This podcast has run so much. I mean, we've only been on it for like 6 months. We're just a part of the grand legacy, but there's so much out there, and there's so many different people have come on and spoken about their experiences and their stories. That if you've enjoyed, you know, hearing us talk about different experiences from just a handful of role models, you'll really love going back through our archives and listening to all the different stories and discussions that we've had on the podcast so far. So I'd really urge you to do that.
You're listening to Just Like Us, the monthly show for LGBT young people.
For this month's Q&A, we're going to ask Elly, tell us what exactly the difference between bisexuality and pansexuality, because the two sometimes people tend to confuse them.
Yeah, okay. This is a great question, and I think it's one that a lot of people kind of wonder. And basically, there is not a huge amount of difference between these two words. Pansexual people don't experience gender-related attraction, so they feel attraction to people. The gender kind of doesn't really play a factor in the attraction. And bisexuality is attraction to people of more than one gender, and so the gender kind of is a factor still. So like some bisexual people might not be attracted to people of every gender. Some people may have a preference towards a certain gender or another. Some people will say that their attraction to different genders is a slightly different experience, that feel differently towards different genders, or may feel like they have more shifts in their attractions throughout their lifetime, and so they prefer that term. But I mean, it's one of those things that actually, as someone who is attracted to different genders, you can actually just choose which word fits you best. You know, all labels are about choosing which helps you and which describes your identity best. And I know people with both identities who are all wonderful. So I hope we've answered that one sufficiently.
You're listening to Just Like Us, the monthly show for LGBT young people.
Hi everyone, it's Char and I'm doing this month's JLU Choice. My recommendation is related to the topic of this month's podcast and I'm so excited about it. It's a TV series called First Day and its main character is Hannah, who is a transgender girl about to start secondary school. I've never seen a story like this represented in mainstream media before, so discovering this series was really encouraging for me. Hopefully it shows that we're moving towards a society where young transgender people can have their stories and voices heard more. I also wanted to recommend you a few songs by transgender artists. The first is Flamboyant by Dorian Electra, and then by Kim Petras, I would like to recommend Wrong Turn and Icy. These are all bangers in my opinion, and they've been getting me through lockdown, so I hope you love them as much as I do.
You're listening to Just Like Us, the monthly show for LGBT young people.
Thank you so much, guys, for tuning in this week. We had an amazing conversation on trans and non-binary identities. We hope everybody's keeping safe, especially for, the lockdown that's happening now. Make sure that you're keeping safe and looking after your loved ones. Goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me, and have a great month. We'll speak to you next month. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to Just Like Us, the monthly show for LGBT young people. The music was by Twisterium. We come into schools too. Young people, teachers and parents can find us at www.justlikeus.org.